Harold tossed a single $20 bill across the polished courthouse hallway floor and told Zoe Wood to pick it up if she needed charity. The words echoed beneath the high ceiling, sharp enough for the clerk, the bailiff, and two waiting couples to hear. He said she had never contributed a thing. He said the house was his. Zoe did not bend down immediately. What no one in that hallway knew, what Harold would only understand much later, was that the woman he had just thrown out with $20 was the sole heir to a $200 million trust. And the house he had moved his lover into was never truly his to give. If you believe dignity speaks louder than humiliation, stay with this story. And before we continue, tell me where you're watching from and what your local time is right now. Stories like this remind us that truth takes patience. And if that matters to you, consider subscribing so you don't miss what happens next. Zoe Wood did not argue with Harold in the courthouse hallway. She did not remind him that she had paid the closing costs on the house. She did not mention the nights she stayed awake balancing spreadsheets while he slept. She simply bent down, picked up the $20 bill, folded it once, and placed it into her coat pocket as if it were a receipt she might need later. Outside, the late October air in Columbus, Ohio, felt thinner than usual. The courthouse steps were crowded with people discussing parking tickets, custody hearings, property disputes, ordinary battles of ordinary lives. Zoe walked past them quietly, her posture straight, her face unreadable. The narrator already knew that this would be the last day Zoe Wood would ever walk away from anything empty-handed. But for now, she had a single $20 bill, one leather tote, and a marriage that had ended not with shouting, but with administrative finality. 6 years earlier, Zoe had met Harold Bennett at a mutual friend's 4th of July barbecue. He had been charming in a deliberate way, quick with jokes, attentive without appearing needy. At the time, he was building his career as a mid-level real estate agent, hungry for listings and recognition. Zoe, who worked as a documentation analyst for a private estate management firm, found his ambition refreshing. She did not tell him that the estate firm she worked for was connected to her own family's trust. She did not tell him that the Wood family trust, quiet, diversified, structured through generations, held assets that exceeded $200 million. It had never felt necessary. Zoe had grown up in a household where money was discussed clinically, not emotionally. Her father had insisted that wealth was a responsibility, not an identity. When he passed away, the trust had transferred into a structure overseen by attorney Daniel Whitmore, with Zoe as the sole beneficiary. The conditions were simple. She would receive full operational control at 35 or earlier if a triggering life event required asset protection. She was 32 now, and Harold had just provided that triggering event. But Harold did not know that. He believed he was divorcing a quiet woman with a modest salary and no family backing. He believed he had carried the financial weight of their marriage. He was wrong in ways that would eventually become measurable. When Zoe reached her car, a sensible silver Honda parked 2 blocks away, she sat inside without starting the engine. She opened her leather tote and removed a small black notebook. Inside were dated entries written in Naztuan, a neat, precise handwriting. Zoe did not journal feelings. She documented facts. Dates of unusual expenses. Dates Harold stayed out overnight for work. Dates passwords were changed. Dates joint account notifications stopped arriving. She flipped to a recent page. September 14th. Harold opened new checking account. No discussion. September 27th. Property tax notice redirected to his email. October 2nd. Overheard phone call. She won't fight. Zoe closed the notebook gently. Harold had underestimated one thing. Silence does not mean absence of awareness. The house on Maple Ridge Drive had been purchased 3 years into their marriage. Harold liked to tell people he had negotiated a steal. What he did not mention was that the down payment had come from a structured transfer Zoe arranged from a personal investment account funds technically classified as separate property under the trust's provisional terms. She had handled the paperwork. She had wired the money. She had signed documents Harold barely read. At the time, she had believed they were building something together. In the months leading up to the courthouse hallway humiliation, the house had changed. It began with small things, framed photos of them removed from the hallway, new throw pillows chosen without her input, wine glasses that were not hers in the drying rack. Then came the scent of unfamiliar perfume lingering in the living room, long after Harold claimed he had been working late. Zoe had not confronted him the first time she suspected there was another woman. She had waited, watched, recorded. When Harold finally admitted he had met someone who understood him better, he framed it as an emotional inevitability. He spoke about compatibility growth, unmet needs. He avoided discussing the timeline. He told her it would be easier if she left quietly. He assured her the house was legally his responsibility. He offered her $20 in the courthouse hallway, as if generosity could be reduced to a symbolic gesture. What Harold did not see, what he had never trained himself to notice, was that Zoe did not react to emotional manipulation. She responded to documentation. By late afternoon, Zoe had checked into a modest extended-stay motel on the edge of town. The carpet smelled faintly of industrial cleaner. The bedspread was neutral beige. There was a small desk against the wall. She unpacked only what she needed, her laptop, her notebook, a folder labeled Property Maple Ridge. Then she opened her email. There were 3 unread messages from the joint bank account. 2 were automated notifications. 1 was a confirmation of a large transfer initiated 2 days earlier. Zoe clicked it open. Transfer $18,750. Destination account ending 4,491. She did not recognize the last 4 digits. She copied the transaction ID into her notebook. Then she opened a secure document vault connected to her personal holdings, an account Harold had never known existed. She reviewed the original wire transfers she had made 3 years earlier for the house's down payment. The source account was tied to a sub-trust under the Wood Family Trust, legally separate, documented, traceable. She leaned back in the motel chair, hands folded in her lap. Outside, a semi-truck passed on the highway, its low rumble steady and indifferent. Zoe was not thinking about revenge. She was thinking about alignment, about facts lining up in chronological order, about how long she would allow Harold to believe the narrative he had constructed. Her phone vibrated, a social media notification. She did not use social media often, but she still had access to Harold's public posts. There it was, a photograph of Harold standing in the living room on Maple Ridge Drive. Beside him stood Madeline Carter Maddie, smiling brightly, one hand resting possessively on the kitchen counter Zoe had chosen. New beginnings, the caption read. Grateful for honesty and fresh starts. Zoe studied the image carefully. The angle of the camera showed more than Harold intended. In the reflection of the hallway mirror, a framed certificate was visible. The original deed summary she had insisted on mounting temporarily while renovations were completed. She zoomed in. There it was, her name, Zoe Wood. She did not smile. She simply took a screenshot and saved it into a new folder labeled Evidence Public Statements. Then she closed her laptop. In another part of the city, Harold poured 2 glasses of wine and told Maddie that everything had gone smoothly. He said Zoe had taken the money without argument. He said she would figure something out. Maddie laughed and called Zoe naive. Harold believed the hardest part was over, but the narrator already knew something he did not. The moment Harold offered Zoe $20 in a courthouse hallway, he triggered the clause that allowed her to formally activate protective oversight of her personal assets. And once activated, oversight meant review. Review meant scrutiny. Scrutiny meant numbers. Zoe turned off the motel lamp and lay down fully clothed on the bedspread. She stared at the ceiling for a long time, listening to the hum of the air conditioner. She was not grieving Harold. She was recalibrating. In the morning, she would call Rebecca Sloan, a divorce attorney known for procedural precision. In the morning, she would request a full accounting. In the morning, Harold's assumption that she would disappear quietly would begin to unravel, not with shouting, not with spectacle, but with paperwork. For now, she closed her eyes. The $20 bill remained folded in her coat pocket on the chair beside the bed. She had kept it, not because she needed it, but because someday, when the accounting was complete and the numbers were placed side by side, she would remember the exact amount Harold believed she was worth, and she would let the math answer him. Harold did not wait long. 3 days after Zoe checked into the extended stay motel, a moving truck idled in front of the house on Maple Ridge Drive. It was mid-morning, the kind of hour when most neighbors were at work, and the street usually sat in mild suburban stillness. But curtains shifted that day. Front doors opened just slightly. Observations were made. Madeline Carter arrived in a compact white SUV, sunglasses, large expression triumphant. She stepped out, holding a garment bag and a small designer purse, glancing once at the house, as if confirming ownership through admiration alone. Harold met her at the door with a kiss too theatrical for privacy and too eager for dignity. Mrs. Evelyn Harper, who lived directly across the street, watched from her front window. At 71, she had developed the discipline of quiet noticing. She had watched Zoe plant tulips in early spring. She had watched Zoe shovel snow without complaint when Harold was traveling. She had watched Zoe carry groceries alone on evenings Harold's car was absent. Now she watched Harold carry Maddie's suitcases across the same threshold Zoe had crossed 6 years earlier in a white summer dress after their wedding reception. Mrs. Harper said nothing, but she remembered everything. Inside the house, Maddie moved with casual possession. She opened closets, tested cabinet hinges, stood in front of the bathroom mirror, adjusting her hair as though rehearsing a future she assumed was secure. "This place is bigger than I thought," she said. Harold smiled, chest slightly inflated. "It's a solid investment, good neighborhood, appreciating value." He did not mention that the appreciation had been calculated and forecasted by Zoe long before the purchase. He did not mention that she had reviewed property tax projections, neighborhood zoning plans, and resale history before recommending the offer price he later bragged about negotiating. Instead, he opened a bottle of wine before noon. By afternoon, Maddie's belongings had been arranged into drawers Zoe once organized by season. A framed photo of Harold and Maddie replaced the wedding portrait that had quietly disappeared weeks earlier. Harold felt lighter. He mistook relief for victory. Across town, Zoe sat at the small desk in her motel room, reviewing a timeline she had begun constructing the night before. She worked methodically, creating columns in a spreadsheet. Date, event, financial activity, documentation source, cross-reference needed. Her training in estate documentation had taught her something fundamental. Emotion fades, records persist. She paused briefly when her phone vibrated. A text message from an unknown number. "I hope you're okay. You deserved better. Each." Zoe studied the initials. It took a moment before she realized. Evelyn Harper. They had exchanged holiday cookies twice in 6 years. They had once spoken for 10 minutes about drought-resistant plants. Zoe replied simply, "Thank you." She did not elaborate. Mrs. Harper responded with a photograph. It was discreet, taken from across the street. The moving truck, Maddie's SUV. Harold carrying a box labeled "Kitchen Fragile." Zoe saved the image into her evidence folder without commentary. She was not surprised. Harold had always moved quickly when something felt exciting. Impulsivity had been part of his charm in the early years. It made him decisive in negotiations, persuasive with clients. But impulsivity rarely consulted documentation. Zoe opened social media again that evening. Maddie had posted a short video from the living room. "Finally settled in?" she said into the camera, laughing. "Feels good to be somewhere I'm wanted." The video panned slowly across the hardwood floors Zoe had refinished during their 3rd year of marriage. It lingered on the stone fireplace Zoe had selected after reviewing dozens of suppliers. It ended with Harold entering the frame, wrapping his arm around Maddie's waist. Zoe watched the video twice. On the second viewing, she muted the sound and focused on reflections in the window glass. Reflections often revealed what people forgot to stage: There on the hallway table sat a stack of unopened mail. Zoe recognized the envelope shape. County property tax notice. She checked her email immediately. The notification had not been redirected successfully. A duplicate copy had been sent to her archived address. She opened it. The tax assessment listed both Harold Bennett and Zoe Wood as co-owners. Joint title, not amended, not transferred. Harold had never filed the paperwork to change it. He had assumed possession equaled ownership. Zoe closed the document and leaned back. This was not about reclaiming a house. It was about clarifying a structure. The narrator already knew the truth. Harold would soon confront the down payment's origin mattered. The structure of the funds mattered. The title language mattered. And Harold had overlooked every one of those details. That night, Zoe called Rebecca Sloane's office and left a voicemail requesting a consultation. She did not mention revenge. She did not mention humiliation. She mentioned documentation irregularities and potential asset misrepresentation. Rebecca Sloane returned the call the next morning at precisely 8:12 a.m. Her voice was calm, efficient. Miss Wood, I reviewed the brief summary you sent. I'll need copies of the original wire transfer and the deed. Also, any evidence suggesting premeditated financial separation. Zoe glanced at her notebook. I have dates, she said, and transaction IDs. Rebecca paused faint approval in her silence. Good, she replied. Bring everything. Meanwhile, Harold hosted a small dinner gathering that weekend. 2 colleagues from his real estate office arrived carrying a bottle of bourbon. Maddie prepared a meal she described as their first official dinner. Laughter echoed through the house. One colleague asked casually, everything finalized with Zoe. Harold shrugged. She walked away, didn't want to fight, took what she could. The colleague nodded, accepting the narrative without inquiry. Maddie added, some people just aren't built for competition. They clinked glasses. But later that evening, after the guests had left, Harold opened the mail from the hallway table. His expression shifted slightly. Property tax assessment. Joint ownership. He frowned. That's probably just a delay in updating records, he muttered. Maddie, half listening, asked, does it matter? Harold folded the paper. No, he said quickly. It's just paperwork. He placed it in a drawer instead of filing it. Across town, Zoe sat in Rebecca Sloane's office the following Monday. The office walls were lined with neatly labeled case files. No decorative excess, no performative intimidation. Rebecca examined the documents Zoe provided. The original wire transfer. The trust documentation outlining the provisional sub-trust from which the funds had originated. The deed listing joint ownership. The recent bank transfer Harold initiated without disclosure. Rebecca folded her hands. He may believe this is straightforward, she said carefully, but the source of the down payment complicates things significantly. Zoe nodded once. I'm not interested in spectacle, she replied. Only accuracy. Rebecca's gaze sharpened. Accuracy, she said, is often more devastating than spectacle. Zoe did not smile. She opened her notebook and added a new entry. October 17th. Legal counsel retained. Back on Maple Ridge Drive. Maddie rearranged furniture to suit her aesthetic preferences. She removed Zoe's remaining houseplants and placed them outside on the patio. One of them, a small potted fern, wilted under the early frost that night. Mrs. Harper watched again from across the street. She saw Harold laugh as Maddie posed for another photograph on the front steps. She also noticed something else. A courier vehicle pulled up briefly the next afternoon, delivering a certified envelope. Harold signed for it without hesitation. He did not read it immediately. He placed it unopened on the kitchen counter beside the fruit bowl Zoe had once kept filled. The narrator already knew what was inside. A formal notice requesting full financial disclosure. A procedural beginning. Harold had believed the story ended in a courthouse hallway with a $20 bill. But the story had only just begun. And Zoe Wood, who had left quietly, was not disappearing. She was aligning documents. The certified envelope sat unopened on the kitchen counter for nearly 4 hours. Harold noticed it twice before he finally tore it open. The first time was when he reached for a glass of water. He glanced at the return address, Sloan and Mercer Family Law, and felt a mild tightening in his chest. He told himself it was procedural. Divorce required paperwork. Zoe had always been methodical. Of course, she would hire someone precise. The second time was when Maddie asked what it was. Probably just formalities, Harold said lightly, though he hadn't read a word yet. By the time he slid a finger beneath the envelope's flap, evening light had shifted across the kitchen floor. Maddie was in the living room, scrolling through her phone, half watching a reality show. Harold unfolded the letter. Notice of request for financial disclosure. Temporary motion regarding marital property. He read more slowly after that. The language was calm, structured, almost polite. It requested full documentation of joint accounts, new accounts opened within the last 90 days, credit obligations, property-related expenses, and any transfers exceeding $5,000. It also referenced the original down payment on the Maple Ridge property and requested documentation of its source. Harold's jaw tightened. That's unnecessary, he muttered. In the motel room across town, Zoe was sitting at the small desk, reviewing scanned copies of the same document Rebecca Sloan had filed that morning. Rebecca had walked her through every clause before submitting it. Discovery isn't aggression, Rebecca had explained. It's clarity. Zoe had nodded. Clarity was something she understood. She opened her laptop and pulled up the archived email from 3 years earlier, the one confirming the wire transfer for the house's down payment. The amount was precise. The originating account was labeled Wood Family Subtrust, Capital Allocation Branch. Zoe had transferred the funds under her provisional discretionary authority. At the time, she had documented the transfer, carefully labeling it as a marital residence investment. Harold had been in the room when she initiated the wire. He had been pacing, excited about closing day. "You handle the boring stuff better than I do," he had joked. She had smiled faintly. Now she reviewed the deed. Joint tenancy, no amendments, no post-closing adjustments. She compared the deed with the mortgage documents. The mortgage listed both names, but the down payment origin remained traceable and separate. Zoe did not rush. She printed each document and placed it in a binder tabbed carefully. Section A, Property Acquisition. Section B, Financial Transfers. Section C, Communication Records. Section D, Public Statements. Her movements were steady, almost meditative. Across town, Harold paced the kitchen floor. Maddie eventually wandered in. "What does it say?" she asked. He handed her the letter. She skimmed it, eyebrows lifting slightly at the mention of financial disclosure. "Is this serious?" "It's standard," Harold replied quickly. "She's just trying to complicate things." "Does she have a claim on the house?" Maddie asked. Harold hesitated just long enough to create doubt. "No," he said firmly. "It's in both our names, but I've been paying most of the mortgage." Maddie looked reassured by confidence, not documentation. Neither of them asked about the down payment. The next morning, Harold logged into his online banking portal. He scrolled through recent transactions. There was the $18,750 transfer he had moved into his new personal account. There were restaurant charges, a boutique hotel stay from 2 months earlier, jewelry purchases. He swallowed. Some of those dates overlapped with weeks he had told Zoe he was attending out-of-town property seminars. He told himself it didn't matter. The house was what mattered. Possession was 9/10 of the law, he had once heard someone say. But Harold had never been particularly attentive to the remaining 10th. Zoe, meanwhile, drove to Rebecca Sloan's office for a follow-up meeting. Rebecca had already begun drafting a secondary motion. "We'll request temporary exclusive occupancy pending review," Rebecca explained. "Given the source of the down payment, there's a credible argument that your separate funds significantly contributed." Zoe listened without interruption. "I don't want her removed publicly," she said after a pause. Rebecca glanced up. "You're referring to Miss Carter, yes?" Rebecca studied Zoe's expression. "You understand," she said carefully, "that the law won't prioritize her comfort." I understand, Zoe replied. But I won't escalate what doesn't need to escalate. Rebecca nodded once. Understood. We proceed with restraint. Zoe appreciated that word. Restraint was different from weakness. Later that afternoon, Harold received an email notification from the county recorder's office. It was automated, a confirmation that a legal inquiry had been filed referencing the Maple Ridge property. He clicked the link. The inquiry cited potential review of ownership structure pending asset verification. Harold felt heat rise behind his ears. He called his real estate colleague Jason Miller. Have you ever dealt with something like this? Harold asked, forwarding the notice. Jason read it aloud over the phone. Looks like her attorney's digging into the funding source. Did she put down most of it? Harold hesitated again. She transferred the down payment, but we were married. It's joint. Jason exhaled slowly. Depends on where the money came from, man. If it was separate property inheritance or trust, it might not be automatically marital. Harold felt the first crack in his certainty. That's ridiculous, he said. We built this together. Jason didn't argue, but he didn't reassure him either. That evening, Maddie noticed Harold was quieter than usual. Everything okay, she asked. He forced a smile. Just paperwork. She nodded, unconcerned. Later, when she fell asleep, Harold opened his laptop again. He searched online inheritance, separate property, divorce, Ohio. The results were not comforting. Across town, Zoe sat on the edge of the motel bed, reviewing the camera footage Mrs. Harper had discreetly sent earlier that afternoon. It showed Maddie stepping onto the porch, rearranging decorative planters. One of them, the ceramic pot Zoe had bought from a local artisan market, was moved carelessly. The footage also captured Harold signing for another certified envelope. Zoe paused the video. She zoomed in on Harold's face. He looked unsettled. Not angry, not triumphant, uncertain. The narrator already knew that uncertainty would grow, because documentation is patient, and documentation accumulates. Zoe opened her notebook again. October 19th. Property inquiry filed. Harold notified. She closed the notebook gently. There was no satisfaction in her movements, only alignment. On Maple Ridge Drive, Harold stood at the kitchen counter, staring at the house around him. The granite countertops, the custom cabinets, the stone fireplace. He had told Maddie it was theirs now. He had told himself Zoe had walked away. But ownership is not defined by who occupies a space. It's defined by who can prove it. Harold reached for the drawer where he had placed the property tax notice. He unfolded it again. Joint tenancy. He imagined Zoe alone, somewhere modest, counting what little she had left. He did not imagine her assembling binders. He did not imagine her attorney preparing motions. He did not imagine the trust documents resting in a secure digital vault with timestamps older than their marriage. He believed the $20 bill had been a closing statement. He did not yet understand it had been recorded as an exhibit. And, as Harold stood in the kitchen of a house he believed was secure, Zoe Wood sat quietly beneath the hum of a motel air conditioner, organizing the architecture of a truth that required no raised voice. The paper trail was forming, and it did not forget. The Wood Family Trust had never been designed for spectacle. It existed quietly, layered through holding companies, diversified portfolios, municipal bonds, commercial real estate interests, and long-term equity positions accumulated over decades. Zoe had grown up attending annual review meetings where numbers were discussed with the same tone most families reserved for weather reports: gains, losses, allocations, rebalancing. No one applauded wealth. It was audited. After her father's death, Daniel Whitmore had stepped fully into the role of trustee. He was a man in his late 50s, precise in speech and allergic to unnecessary drama. He had known Zoe since she was 10 years old, when she used to sit at the edge of conference tables, swinging her legs while adults discussed fiduciary responsibilities. He had once told her money reveals character faster than hardship. Zoe had never forgotten that, On the fourth morning after Harold received Rebecca Sloane's disclosure request, Daniel Whitmore called. Zoe was at the small motel desk again reviewing cross-referenced timestamps between Harold's recent transfers and the dates he had claimed to be working late. Her phone vibrated and she glanced at the caller ID. Daniel Whitmore. She answered calmly. "Good morning. I've been notified," Daniel said without preamble. His voice carried the quiet weight of someone accustomed to oversight. "Your divorce filing has triggered the protective review clause." Zoe leaned back in her chair. "I expected that," she replied. There was a pause, not disapproval, not surprise. Simply calculation. As trustee, Daniel continued, "I'm obligated to evaluate potential exposure to trust-derived assets. I'll need confirmation regarding the Maple Ridge property. I've already provided documentation to my attorney," Zoe said. "The down payment originated from Sub-Trust Capital Allocation Branch 3. "Yes," Daniel said. "I have the records here." The narrator already knew what Harold did not. The Wood family trust was structured with meticulous compartmentalization. Funds transferred for marital residence purposes were documented as conditional allocations, not outright gifts. Conditional allocations meant oversight. Oversight meant traceability. Traceability meant evidence. Zoe, Daniel said carefully, "Did Harold ever disclose the source of those funds in any personal financial statements?" "No." "Did he represent the down payment as joint savings?" "Yes." Daniel inhaled slowly. That mischaracterization may become relevant. Zoe did not react outwardly. She had never enjoyed confrontation. But she did not avoid correction. "I don't want unnecessary escalation," she said. "Only accuracy." Daniel's tone softened slightly. "Accuracy," he replied, "is the trust's preferred outcome." After the call ended, Zoe opened a new document folder labeled Trust Activation Protective Review. She scanned in the original transfer authorization forms she had signed 3 years earlier. Each page carried her signature and a digital timestamp. Each referenced the internal allocation code. She knew what those codes meant. Harold did not. Across town, Harold was meeting with a local attorney recommended by Jason Miller. The attorney's office was smaller than Rebecca Sloane's. Framed diplomas lined the walls, but the file cabinets were visibly worn from years of hurried consultations. Harold handed over Rebecca's disclosure request and the county inquiry notice. The attorney skimmed them, then looked up. "Did your wife contribute to the purchase of the house?" "She wired the down payment," Harold admitted. "But we were married." "That makes it marital, right?" "Depends," the attorney said. "Where did her funds come from?" Harold hesitated. "She works in estate documentation." "Probably savings." The attorney's expression remained neutral. "If it was inheritance or trust property, and if it can be traced, it may be considered separate property." Harold felt irritation flare. "That's ridiculous," he said. "We live there together." "Living together doesn't override source tracing," the attorney replied evenly. Harold shifted in his chair. "Can we argue commingling?" "Possibly," the attorney said. "But I'll need documentation." "Documentation." The word felt heavier than it should have. Back at the motel, Zoe received a secure email from Daniel Whitmore. Attached were updated statements reflecting the current valuation of the Wood Family Trust. The total assets under management now exceeded $213 million. Zoe stared at the number without emotion. She had never drawn from the trust for lifestyle upgrades. She had never purchased luxury vehicles or second homes. She had lived within her salary intentionally, because wealth in her mind was leverage, not display. Daniel's email included a brief note. "Per trust guidelines, you are eligible to assume discretionary control under protective clause activation. Please confirm whether you wish to exercise that authority at this time." Zoe closed her eyes briefly. Exercising authority would mean increased legal backing. It would mean access to resources Harold could not anticipate. It would mean shifting the power dynamic entirely. But it would also mean revealing a part of herself she had deliberately kept private. She opened her notebook. Question activate discretionary control. She drew 2 columns beneath it: pros asset protection, legal clarity; financial stability star; public disclosure risk; escalation perception; emotional complication. Zoe did not rush the decision. Across Maple Ridge Drive, Maddie rearranged the living room again. She had begun replacing certain pieces of furniture, saying they didn't reflect her taste. Harold agreed without resistance. The purchases went onto his new credit card. Later that evening, Maddie scrolled through social media comments beneath her recent post. One comment caught her eye. Didn't that house belong to his wife? Maddie frowned and deleted it. Harold noticed her expression. What people are being weird, she said. Someone mentioned Zoe. Harold shrugged. Let them talk. But later, alone in the kitchen, he opened the drawer again and removed the county tax notice. Joint tenancy. He imagined the courtroom hearing Rebecca Sloan had scheduled for the following month. He imagined Zoe standing quietly beside her attorney. He did not imagine her trust statements. He did not imagine Daniel Whitmore reviewing asset exposure. He still believed the fight was small. The narrator already knew it was not. The next morning, Zoe drafted a brief email to Daniel Whitmore. I confirm activation of discretionary control under protective clause. Please coordinate with legal counsel to ensure proper asset shielding and documentation. She reread the message once before sending it. No anger, no commentary, just confirmation. Within hours, Daniel's office initiated internal adjustments. Sub-trust funds were formally designated as separate property under heightened review. Legal memoranda were prepared documenting the origin of the Maple Ridge down payment. Asset tracing summaries were compiled with transaction identifiers older than Zoe's marriage. The machinery of quiet wealth began to turn, not loudly, not publicly, but thoroughly. Zoe closed her laptop and stood by the motel window. Outside, the highway stretched in indifferent lines toward the horizon. She did not feel triumphant. She felt steady. Harold had believed she was walking away with $20. In reality, she had just activated a financial structure designed to withstand generations of scrutiny. And soon, when documents were placed side by side in a courtroom, numbers would speak in a language Harold had never bothered to learn. Rebecca Sloan's office did not display motivational quotes. There were no framed slogans about justice or victory. Only shelves of indexed binders and a large conference table positioned beneath recessed lighting that made every document appear sharper than it felt in hand. Zoe sat at that table, with her binder open tabs aligned precisely. She wore a simple navy coat and low heels. No jewelry except a thin silver watch. Rebecca entered carrying a legal pad already marked with notes. I've reviewed the trust activation confirmation, Rebecca said, taking her seat. Your timing was appropriate. Zoe nodded once. I didn't want to escalate, but I won't be misrepresented. Rebecca appreciated that answer. Let's discuss next steps, she said. Harold's attorney has responded. They're requesting mediation before formal hearings. Zoe folded her hands. Mediation implies negotiation. Yes, and negotiation implies leverage. Rebecca's eyes flickered with something close to respect. You understand this process better than most clients, she said. Zoe did not respond to the compliment. Rebecca continued. They're likely hoping you'll settle quickly, possibly for partial equity in the house. Zoe considered that quietly. The Maple Ridge property was not her emotional attachment anymore. That had shifted the night Harold offered her $20, but it remained a legal matter. I'm open to mediation, Zoe said finally, as long as the financial tracing is acknowledged. Rebecca made a note. We'll present the origin of funds. If they contest it, we proceed to full evidentiary hearing. Across town, Harold sat in his attorney's office reviewing Zoe's activation of discretionary control under the Wood Family Trust. The document was concise, structured. It did not flaunt numbers, but it confirmed that Zoe's financial resources were under protective oversight and legally distinct from marital property. Harold read the name Wood Family Trust twice. He had never asked about her last name before they married. He had assumed it was ordinary. "Is this serious?" he asked his attorney. "It means she has separate assets," the attorney replied. "Substantial ones based on this structure." "How substantial?" The attorney hesitated. "If the trust valuation summary attached here is accurate?" "Very." Harold felt a slow chill. She never mentioned any of this. "Did you ask?" Harold looked away. He had once joked that Zoe was financially boring. Now he wondered what else he had dismissed. That evening, Maddie noticed the tension in Harold's posture. "You've been distant all day," she said. "Just legal stuff," he replied. "Is she asking for money?" "She's asking for documentation." Maddie frowned. "But you said she didn't have much." Harold hesitated again. "She works with estates," he said carefully. "Apparently her family had one." Maddie stared at him. "You're telling me she's rich?" Harold's jaw tightened. "I don't know the details." But doubt had already entered the room. The narrator already knew that doubt spreads faster than facts. Back in Rebecca Sloane's office, the first mediation session was scheduled for the following week. Zoe returned to the motel and spent the evening organizing additional materials. Rebecca requested email threads between Harold and Maddie, predating their separation, transaction logs, public posts. She did not linger on the emotional content of those messages. One email stood out, from Harold Bennett to Madeline Carter, date August 22nd. "She'll never fight. She doesn't have the resources. I'll handle it clean." Zoe read the sentence twice. She did not feel anger. She felt confirmation. She printed the email and placed it behind tab C. Later that night, she walked outside the motel for fresh air. The parking lot lights cast long shadows. Cars moved along the highway in distant streams. Her phone vibrated. Daniel Whitmore again. "Rebecca contacted me," he said. "I'll provide a formal affidavit regarding fund origin." "Thank you," Zoe replied. "You understand," Daniel continued, "once this enters record, the valuation of the trust may become partially disclosed." Zoe nodded, though he could not see her. "I'm aware." "And you're prepared for Harold to realize the scale, yes?" There was a pause. "Your father would approve of how you're handling this," Daniel said quietly. Zoe did not trust her voice immediately. "Thank you," she said after a moment. Across Maple Ridge Drive, Harold lay awake long after Maddie fell asleep. He replayed the courthouse hallway in his mind. The way Zoe had bent down calmly. The way she had folded the $20 bill without expression. He had interpreted that calmness as defeat. Now he reconsidered. He rose quietly and walked into the kitchen. He opened his laptop and searched Wood Family Trust, Ohio. Several entries appeared: business filings, commercial property holdings, charitable foundation contributions. He clicked one link. The Wood Family Foundation had donated to hospital expansions and university scholarships over the past decade. He stared at the numbers: 6-figure donations, 7-figure endowments. He swallowed. "Zoe Wood," he whispered aloud, as though saying her full name might rearrange reality. He realized he had never truly known the woman he married, not because she had deceived him, but because he had never asked questions that required listening. The next morning, Rebecca Sloane filed a supplemental motion requesting temporary exclusive occupancy pending review of separate property contribution. The motion did not mention humiliation. It did not reference Maddie. It focused on numbers, contribution percentages, fund origin, title structure. When Harold received the filing, he felt something unfamiliar. Not anger, not resentment, exposure. Maddie noticed his hands tremble slightly as he read. "What does it say?" "She's requesting temporary control of the house." Maddie stared at him. "Can she do that, if the down payment is ruled separate property?" "Maybe." Silence stretched between them. For the first time since moving into Maple Ridge Drive, Maddie looked around the room not with possession, but with uncertainty. At the motel, Zoe closed her laptop and placed the binder back into her tote. She checked out of the extended stay room later that afternoon and moved into a short-term furnished apartment downtown. It was modest but clean. Neutral walls, minimal decor. She did not want to return to Maple Ridge Drive, even if she regained it. Some spaces absorbed too much history. That evening, she opened her notebook again. October 23rd. Mediation scheduled. Supplemental motion filed. She paused before writing the next line, then added, "Remain steady." The narrator already knew that steadiness would matter more than wealth, because Harold's panic would grow louder, and Zoe's silence would grow more powerful. The first mediation session would not end in shouting. It would end in realization. But for now, as Columbus moved through another ordinary evening, two people prepared for the same meeting with entirely different understandings of what was at stake. Harold feared losing a house. Zoe intended to correct a record. And correction, when backed by documentation, rarely requires raised voices. It only requires patience. Mediation was scheduled for 10 o'clock on a gray Thursday morning. The building itself was unremarkable brick exterior, narrow lobby, muted carpeting that absorbed footsteps. There were no dramatic entrances, no raised voices echoing down hallways. Just appointments names called quietly, doors opening and closing with administrative indifference. Zoe arrived 10 minutes early. She wore a charcoal coat over a simple cream blouse. Her hair was pulled back neatly. In her hand, she carried the same leather tote that had held her notebook the day Harold handed her $20. She did not look toward the entrance when Harold walked in with his attorney, but she was aware of him. The narrator knew she noticed everything. Harold hesitated when he saw her. There was something unsettling about her stillness. He had expected visible strain, financial anxiety, perhaps resentment. Instead, she appeared composed, not hardened, not brittle, just aligned. Maddie was not present. She had wanted to come. Harold had insisted it would look unnecessary. Inside the mediation room, a long rectangular table divided the space. A neutral mediator, Margaret Ellis, sat at the head reviewing files. "Thank you all for being here," Margaret began. "The goal today is resolution, not escalation." Zoe folded her hands on the table. Harold shifted in his chair. Rebecca Sloan began by presenting the tracing summary. 3 years ago, she said evenly, sliding copies across the table, Miss Wood transferred $164,000 as the down payment for the Maple Ridge property. The source of those funds has been verified as a sub-trust allocation under the Wood Family Trust. Documentation of the origin timestamp and internal allocation code are included. Harold's attorney reviewed the papers, flipping pages carefully. Harold leaned forward slightly. "It was our marital home," he said. "We both lived there." Rebecca did not react to the emotional framing. "Living in a property does not alter the classification of separately sourced funds," she replied. Margaret Ellis interjected gently. "Mr. Bennett, did you dispute the origin of the down payment?" Harold hesitated. "I didn't know it was separate." Zoe did not look at him. She watched the mediator instead. Margaret nodded. Lack of knowledge does not reclassify assets. Harold felt heat creep up his neck. Rebecca continued. "Additionally, we have evidence of unilateral financial transfers initiated by Mr. Bennett within 90 days of separation." She slid another document across the table. "The $18,750 transfer." Harold swallowed. "That was personal," he said. "It originated from a joint account," Rebecca replied calmly. Margaret leaned back slightly. "Mr. Bennett, are you prepared to provide a full accounting of expenditures?" Over the past 6 months, Harold's attorney spoke before he could answer. "We will comply with discovery requirements." Zoe remained silent. Her silence was not passive. It was structured. Rebecca turned to the final section. "Miss Wood is requesting temporary exclusive occupancy pending final determination of property classification. Alternatively, we are open to an equitable buyout reflecting separate contribution percentages." Harold looked at Zoe for the first time since entering the room. "You want the house?" he asked, disbelief edging his voice. Zoe met his eyes briefly. "I want accuracy," she said quietly. There was no accusation in her tone, only clarity. The narrator already knew Harold felt something unfamiliar in that moment, the shift of ground beneath assumption. Mediation adjourned after 2 hours without resolution. Harold requested time to review the tracing documents. Zoe left the building without speaking further. Outside, cold air brushed her face. She did not rush to her car. She stood for a moment beneath the gray sky, breathing evenly. Her phone vibrated. A notification from her secure email. Rebecca had forwarded an additional set of documents obtained through preliminary discovery email threads between Harold and Maddie. Zoe opened them in her car. One message stood out. From Harold Bennett to Madeline Carter, date August 29th. "I'll start moving funds soon. She won't notice. She's too focused on her boring spreadsheets." Zoe read the sentence once, then again. She did not react outwardly. She saved the email under tab C. Back at Maple Ridge Drive, Harold entered the house with shoulders heavier than when he had left that morning. Maddie was waiting in the kitchen. "Well," she'd asked, "she's claiming the down payment was from a trust." Maddie blinked. "A trust, yes. As in..." Rich Harold exhaled sharply. "I don't know. You didn't know she had money. She never said anything." Maddie's expression shifted. "You told me she didn't have resources." Harold's jaw tightened. "I assumed." Maddie walked toward the living room, slowly glancing at the furniture she had rearranged days earlier. "Can she take the house?" "If the court rules the funds separate, maybe." Silence expanded. The house no longer felt like a fresh beginning. It felt temporary. That evening, Harold opened his laptop again and reread the tracing summary Rebecca had presented. Each transaction was listed with timestamp precision. Each allocation was labeled, each signature traceable. He noticed something he had missed before. Zoe's signature on the original transfer authorization. He had never signed that page. He had never asked to. He had been busy choosing paint colors. Across town, Zoe sat at her small apartment desk and opened her notebook. October 26th. Mediation incomplete. Harold uncertain. She paused, then added, "Email dated August 29th, confirms premeditated transfer intent." She closed the notebook. The narrator already knew the weight of that email would matter. Intent shifts cases. Intent reframes narrative. Intent removes ambiguity. Zoe did not celebrate this discovery. She felt no satisfaction. She felt confirmation. Later that night, Mrs. Harper across Maple Ridge Drive noticed raised voices for the first time. Not shouting, but sharper tones. Through her partially open window, she caught fragments. "You said she had nothing. You didn't tell me. It's just legal maneuvering." Mrs. Harper closed her curtains quietly. She did not need to hear more. Inside the house, Maddie stood near the staircase, arms folded. "I moved my life here," she said. "I know," Harold replied. "You told me it was secure. It will be," he insisted. But his voice lacked conviction. In his mind, the image of Zoe in the mediation room replayed. Her calmness, her measured words. "I want accuracy." He had mistaken silence for surrender. Now he began to suspect silence had been preparation. At her apartment, Zoe turned off her desk lamp and stood by the window overlooking downtown lights. She thought about the email dated August 29th. She thought about the courthouse hallway. She thought about the $20 bill folded neatly in a small envelope in her drawer. She did not feel anger. She felt alignment. The paper trail was no longer forming. It was solidifying. And Harold, who once believed she would not fight, was beginning to understand something far more unsettling. Zoe Wood was not fighting. She was documenting. Discovery began without drama. No one raised their voice. No one slammed doors. Instead, files moved digitally, methodically between offices. Requests were submitted. Deadlines were acknowledged. Extensions were negotiated in writing. Zoe understood that discovery was not an event. It was erosion. Each document requested shaved away assumption. Each disclosure narrowed narrative. Rebecca Sloan sat across from Zoe in her office once more, a fresh stack of printed bank records laid out in careful rows. "They've complied with the first financial disclosure request," Rebecca said. "Partial compliance, but enough to begin analysis." Zoe leaned forward slightly. Rebecca slid forward a highlighted page. "Joint checking account," she said. "Past 6 months." Zoe read silently. Restaurant charges she didn't recognize. Boutique hotel bookings during weeks. Harold claimed he was attending regional property seminars. A jewelry purchase, $4,870, dated 2 days before Zoe's birthday. She remembered that birthday. Harold had given her a handwritten note and said they were keeping things simple. Zoe did not comment. Rebecca turned another page. "And this," she said. 3 separate transfers to an account ending in 4,491. The same account linked to the $18,750 transfer Zoe had noticed earlier. Total $42,300. "Do we know whose account that is?" Zoe asked. "Not yet," Rebecca replied. "We've requested account holder identification." Zoe nodded once. She felt no rush of anger, only confirmation of pattern. The narrator already knew the pattern would matter more than any individual purchase. Pattern implies intent. Intent alters rulings. Later that afternoon, Rebecca received supplemental documentation from Harold's attorney credit card statements. Rebecca forwarded them immediately to Zoe. When Zoe opened the file at her apartment, she noticed something subtle. The billing address for Harold's new credit card had been updated 2 weeks before he told her he wanted a separation. Updated to Maple Ridge Drive, but under Harold Bennett only. Zoe opened her notebook. September 10th. Credit card address change Harold only. She drew a thin line beneath the date. Preparation. Across town, Harold sat at the kitchen table with his own copy of the disclosures. Maddie stood nearby, arms crossed. "They're asking for my account information too," she said. "They're tracing joint funds," Harold replied. "If money went into your account, they'll request it." Maddie's expression hardened. "I didn't sign up for this." "You didn't do anything wrong," Harold said quickly. But doubt flickered in his voice, because the statements did not look innocent when stacked together. The boutique hotel bookings, the jewelry purchases, the overlapping dates. Harold had once believed secrecy was protection. Now, secrecy looked like evidence. The next request arrived 2 days later. Rebecca Sloan formally subpoenaed identification for the account ending in 4,491. When the response came, it confirmed what Zoe already suspected. The account belonged to Madeline Carter. 3 transfers from the joint marital account had been deposited into it. Zoe read the confirmation quietly. She did not exhale sharply. She did not shake her head. She simply placed the page behind tab B. Rebecca called her that evening. "We now have documented commingling of joint funds into Miss Carter's personal account," Rebecca said. "Combined with the email stating he intended to move funds without you noticing this, strengthens your position." Zoe looked out her apartment window at the city lights. "I don't want her punished," she said. "This isn't about punishment," Rebecca replied. "It's about restitution." Zoe understood the difference. Restitution restores balance. Punishment seeks satisfaction. She was not seeking satisfaction. Meanwhile, Harold received notice of the subpoena. He confronted Maddie in the living room. "They've confirmed the transfers." Maddie's face drained of color. "You told me it was fine." "It was from our account," Harold said defensively. Our Maddie repeated. "I thought you said you handled everything." Harold ran a hand through his hair. "I didn't think she'd dig like this. You said she wouldn't fight." The sentence hung in the air, heavy with its own irony. Harold remembered writing that email. She won't notice. He felt something close to embarrassment now, not because of the affair, but because of the miscalculation. Back in her apartment, Zoe opened the security footage Mrs. Harper had sent earlier that week. This time, she focused not on Maddie's movements, but on Harold's behavior. On October 3rd, 2 days before he asked Zoe to leave, the footage showed Harold removing a small fireproof box from the study. Zoe paused the video. She zoomed in. The box contained copies of financial documents, insurance policies, tax returns, property records. She knew the box well. She had organized it. He had removed it before asking her to leave. Preparation again. Zoe opened her notebook. October 3rd. Removal of fireproof document box camera evidence. She underlined the date. Intent layered upon intent. The narrator already knew this accumulation would shape the judge's perception more than any emotional testimony. When Rebecca reviewed the footage, she nodded slowly. This demonstrates premeditation regarding asset control, she said. Combined with the transfers, it forms a coherent narrative. Zoe listened quietly. Rebecca leaned back in her chair. Harold underestimated you. Zoe did not respond. Underestimation was not new to her. At Maple Ridge Drive, tension settled into the walls. Maddie had stopped rearranging furniture. She moved more cautiously now, as though conscious of being observed. Harold spent evenings scrolling through legal forums, searching for precedents where inherited funds were reclassified as marital due to shared use. Most cases did not favor his position. One night, he stood in the living room and looked around. The stone fireplace, the hardwood floors, the staircase Zoe had insisted on reinforcing during inspection due to a minor structural flaw Harold had dismissed. He remembered her reviewing inspection reports late into the night. He had called it obsessive. Now he saw it differently. Zoe had never been passive. She had been thorough. The following week, Rebecca filed an updated motion including documented separate origin of down payment, evidence of unilateral fund transfers, email demonstrating intent to conceal. Security footage showing document removal. The motion was not inflammatory. It did not accuse. It presented sequence. Sequence is powerful. Harold read the motion at his kitchen table, hand steady but heart unsteady. Maddie stood behind him silently. "They're building a timeline," she said quietly. Harold nodded. Yes. For the first time, he understood the scope of the miscalculation. He had thought the story was about betrayal. It was about documentation. Across town, Zoe placed the $20 bill into a small envelope labeled Exhibit Symbolic. She did not know yet whether it would ever be introduced formally, but she understood its narrative weight, not because of the amount, because of what it represented. Harold had valued her at $20. The records valued her differently. And as discovery continued, numbers would replace assumptions line by line, date by date, until the truth required no interpretation. Zoe closed her notebook. Outside, city traffic moved in steady streams. Inside Maple Ridge Drive, uncertainty thickened the air, and in a courthouse file already growing heavier by the day, the paper trail spoke in a language Harold could no longer ignore. The house on Maple Ridge Drive had always been quiet at night. It was one of the reasons Zoe chose it. The street curved slightly, limiting through traffic. The trees were mature enough to soften sound. Even the streetlights were positioned in a way that avoided glare through bedroom windows. Now the quiet carried a different quality. It no longer felt peaceful. It felt watched. Harold noticed it first when a courier delivered yet another certified envelope just before dusk. Mrs. Harper's porch light flicked on across the street at the exact moment he signed for it. He felt irrationally that the neighborhood had shifted against him. Inside the envelope was a formal notice of evidentiary supplementation. Rebecca Sloan had submitted additional materials to be entered into preliminary review. Attached was a summary list. Doorbell camera footage October 3rd. October 10th, voicemail transcripts, financial transfer confirmations, public social media posts. Harold's jaw tightened as he scanned the page. Doorbell footage. He walked to the front entryway instinctively and looked at the small black device mounted near the frame. Zoe had installed it 2 years earlier after a package theft incident down the street. "It's just for peace of mind," she had said. Harold had barely paid attention to it. Now he opened the device's companion app on his phone. The system was still connected under a shared login. He scrolled through archived footage. October 3rd. There he was, carrying the small fireproof document box to his car. October 6th. Maddie arriving late in the evening. October 7th. Maddie standing on the porch with a friend laughing. He tapped on the audio icon. Maddie's voice came through clearly. She doesn't even know what she's losing, Maddie said. Harold built this place. Her friend responded. Does she have any money? Maddie laughed lightly. If she did, she wouldn't dress like that. Harold froze. He hadn't known the conversation was recorded. He hadn't known the microphone captured street-level commentary. Across town, Zoe sat at her apartment desk, reviewing the same clip Rebecca had extracted legally through shared account access and proper notification. Zoe watched Maddie's expression, not malicious, but careless, assumptive. Zoe did not take the insult personally. She focused on something else. The timestamp, October 7th, 3 days after Zoe had left. She added it to her timeline. October 7th, public misrepresentation of property ownership video evidence. The narrator already knew the value of such clips was not humiliation, it was contradiction. Because on October 8th, Harold had sent Zoe a text message that read, "Let's keep this private. I don't want drama." Zoe pulled up the voicemail folder Rebecca had requested from the mobile carrier. There were several messages from Harold during the week of separation. She played one dated October 5th. Zoe just signed the informal agreement I sent. It'll make things easier. You don't have the resources to drag this out. Her expression did not change. She saved the audio file and forwarded it to Rebecca. Language matters in legal procedure. Phrases like, "you don't have the resources" shift perception when contrasted with documented financial capability. Later that afternoon, Rebecca called. "We're preparing to submit these audio transcripts as supplementary exhibits," she said. They established narrative inconsistency. Zoe nodded slowly. "Will it escalate tension?" she asked. "It may," Rebecca admitted. "But the escalation won't be from you." That evening, Harold confronted Maddie. "They have porch footage," he said. Maddie's eyes widened. "Of what?" "Of you talking." She stiffened. "Talking about what? About Zoe? About the house?" Maddie exhaled sharply. "That's ridiculous. It was private. It was recorded." Silence filled the space between them. For the first time, Maddie looked uneasy, not defensive, but exposed. "I didn't know," she said quietly. Harold felt something unravel in his chest. He had assumed control. He had assumed narrative dominance. He had not accounted for devices quietly preserving context. Meanwhile, Zoe met with Rebecca again to prepare for the evidentiary review hearing scheduled in 2 weeks. Rebecca laid out the sequence on the table. "Let's walk through it clearly," she said. She placed the documents in chronological order. August 22nd, email, indicating belief Zoe would not fight. August 29th, email expressing intent to move funds without notice. September 10th, credit card address changed. October 3rd, removal of document box camera. October 5th, voicemail asserting Zoe lacked resources. October 6th, 7, Maddie moved into residence. October 7th, video misrepresentation of ownership. October 14th, $18,750 transfer from joint account. Rebecca folded her hands. "This is not about moral judgment," she said. "It's about premeditated asset control." Zoe listened carefully. "And the trust?" she asked. "Daniel Whitmore's affidavit confirms separate origin. That solidifies your claim." Zoe felt a quiet steadiness settle in her chest. Not satisfaction, not triumph, alignment. At Maple Ridge Drive, tension grew visible. Maddie had begun packing certain personal items discreetly, not fully, just precautionary. She no longer posted photos online. Harold noticed, but said nothing. Late that night, he sat alone in the living room. He replayed the voicemail in his mind. "You don't have the resources to drag this out." He had spoken with certainty. He had believed it. Now he wondered how many other assumptions he had made about Zoe. He remembered small moments, her late nights reviewing tax documents, her insistence on saving digital copies of every contract, her calm when he panicked over minor financial setbacks. He had called her cautious. He had not realized she was trained. Across town, Zoe placed the printed voicemail transcript into her binder. She paused before closing it. The $20 bill remained in its envelope in her desk drawer. She opened it briefly. The bill was still folded cleanly. She smoothed it once, then returned it to the envelope. Not as currency, as context. The narrator already knew that when the evidentiary review occurred, the audio would be played in a quiet courtroom. The words would sound smaller than they had in Harold's phone. But their meaning would expand. Because spoken assumptions once recorded lose their protective ambiguity. They become statements. Statements become facts. And facts reshape outcomes. Outside Maple Ridge Drive, Mrs. Harper watered her front garden, slowly observing the house across the street. She noticed fewer lights on at night. She noticed Maddie's car parked farther from the driveway edge. She noticed Harold standing longer at the front window, staring outward. Uncertainty had entered the property. And uncertainty does not leave easily. In her apartment, Zoe turned off her desk lamp and stood in the dark for a moment, letting silence settle. She did not feel vindicated. She felt prepared. The house on Maple Ridge Drive had been quiet before. Now it was listening. And soon, in a courtroom where tone mattered less than timestamps, the recorded truth would speak for itself. Rumors do not begin loudly. They move in fragments, half questions at office desks, pauses in conversation, glances exchanged when someone walks into a room. At Bennett Realty Group, Harold noticed the shift before anyone said anything directly. A colleague who once slapped him on the back now offered only a nod. Another mid-conversation lowered her voice when he approached. Jason Miller was the first to address it. "They're asking questions," Jason said quietly one afternoon, closing the office door behind him. About what Harold asked, though he already knew. About the trust, about the property filing. Someone pulled the public record inquiry. Harold's jaw tightened. "It's procedural," he said. Jason hesitated. Procedural doesn't usually involve 9-page tracing summaries. Harold looked away. The narrator already knew that Harold's greatest discomfort was not financial risk. It was reputational exposure. In real estate, credibility is currency, and documentation once public reshapes perception. Across town, Zoe sat in Rebecca Sloan's office, reviewing the preliminary hearing schedule. "The judge has granted limited review of temporary occupancy," Rebecca said. "He'll want to see clear proportional contribution." Zoe nodded. "Will the audio be introduced now?" she asked. "Yes," Rebecca replied, "not for humiliation, for context." Zoe understood. Context reveals contradiction. Later that evening, Maddie sat at the Maple Ridge kitchen island, scrolling through her phone. A direct message notification appeared. Is it true the house belongs to his wife? She stared at the screen. Another followed. Saw something about a trust in the county records. Maddie closed the app. She looked up as Harold entered the room. "People are messaging me," she said. "About what?" "The house. About Zoe." Harold exhaled slowly. "It'll pass." But it didn't feel like something that would pass. It felt like something unfolding. The following morning, the evidentiary review hearing began in a courtroom that smelled faintly of polished wood and paper. Zoe sat beside Rebecca Sloan, hands folded neatly in her lap. She wore a simple gray suit, no jewelry beyond her watch. Harold sat at the opposing table with his attorney. His posture was straight, but tension showed in the way his fingers tapped lightly against the folder in front of him. The judge reviewed the submitted documents in silence for several minutes. Then he looked up. "Miss Sloan, you're asserting that the down payment originated from separate trust property." "Yes, Your Honor," Rebecca replied calmly. We've provided time-stamped allocation records, trustee affidavit, and internal trust memoranda verifying origin. The judge flipped through the binder. And Mr. Bennett, do you contest the origin? Harold's attorney spoke. We acknowledge the funds were transferred by Miss Wood. However, we argue that shared use of the residence constitutes marital commingling. The judge nodded slightly. Commingling typically requires intent to convert separate property into joint property. Is there documentation indicating such intent? Silence. Harold shifted. Rebecca stood. Your Honor, if I may. She approached the bench and handed over a document. This is an email dated August 29th, written by Mr. Bennett, indicating his belief that Miss Wood would not fight, and that he would start moving funds soon. Additionally, we have audio from October 5th, in which Mr. Bennett asserts Miss Wood lacks the resources to pursue legal action. The judge glanced at Harold. Play the audio. The courtroom grew quieter. The voicemail filled the space, not loudly, not dramatically, but clearly. You don't have the resources to drag this out. The words sounded smaller than Harold remembered. Zoe did not look at him. She looked forward. The judge stopped the playback. Mr. Bennett, he said evenly, your statement suggests awareness of financial imbalance. Combined with evidence of unilateral transfers, this raises concerns regarding intent. Harold swallowed. We were separating, he said. The judge nodded. And during separation, transparency is required. Rebecca returned to her seat. There was no applause, no visible reaction from Zoe, only the steady turning of pages. Outside the courtroom, a few local reporters lingered, not because of scandal, but because the Wood family trust name had appeared in filings. Whispers traveled quickly when substantial assets were involved. Maddie watched from her car across the street, hands gripping the steering wheel. She had insisted on coming, but refused to enter. When Harold exited the courthouse, his expression was not anger. It was recalibration. What happened? Maddie asked when he reached the car. They're granting temporary review of occupancy, he said. What does that mean? It means the judge is considering giving her control until final ruling. Maddie stared at the courthouse doors. She's not what you said she was, she murmured. Harold did not respond. Across town, Zoe returned to her apartment and placed the updated court summary into her binder. Temporary occupancy under review, pending final determination. She opened her notebook, November 2nd. Audio entered into record. Judicial concern noted. She paused, then added, remain steady. Her phone buzzed. A message from Mrs. Harper. Saw you at the courthouse. Proud of how you carried yourself. Zoe typed back, thank you, nothing more. That evening, Harold received a call from a longtime client. I heard you're in some kind of property dispute, the client said carefully. Should I be concerned? Harold felt the ground shift beneath him. It's personal, he replied. Personal has a way of affecting business, the client said. After the call ended, Harold stood in the living room, staring at the fireplace Zoe had selected. He realized something unsettling. The house did not feel like his achievement anymore. It felt like evidence. Maddie watched him from the staircase. You're quiet, she said. Just thinking about her. He hesitated. About everything. Maddie descended slowly. If she wins the house. She won't win, Harold interrupted. It's not like that. The statement surprised even him, because for the first time, he understood the case was not about winning. It was about correction. In her apartment, Zoe prepared dinner alone. Simple quiet. She washed dishes, carefully dried them, placed them back in the cabinet. No music played, no television murmured in the background. Silence did not feel empty. It felt deliberate. The narrator already knew that in the coming weeks, pressure would mount not from confrontation, but from accumulation. The public mask Harold had worn, the confident provider, the decisive negotiator, was thinning. Not because Zoe attacked it, because documentation did. And as Zoe closed her notebook that night, one truth settled firmly into place. She had never needed to raise her voice. The record was doing that for her. The call from Daniel Whitmore came on a Monday morning just after 9. Zoe was at her apartment desk reviewing updated court filings Rebecca had forwarded the night before. The city outside her window moved in muted gray commuters, crossing intersections, buses exhaling air at corners, ordinary life continuing without reference to hearings or trust structures. Her phone vibrated once. Daniel Whitmore. She answered immediately. "Good morning," she said. Zoe Daniel replied, his voice steady as always. "The protective clause has now fully transitioned into discretionary control. As of this morning, you have operational authority over primary trust assets." Zoe leaned back slightly. This was not unexpected. The clause had been triggered when her marital separation entered formal proceedings. But hearing it confirmed felt different than anticipating it. "Understood," she said quietly. "There's more," Daniel continued. "Because the Maple Ridge down payment originated from Subtrust Capital Allocation Branch 3, the trust has a vested interest in recovering or reclassifying that capital allocation if misrepresented." Zoe did not interrupt. "In practical terms, Daniel said the trust is prepared to support your claim for exclusive occupancy, or if you prefer, structured buyout, at current market valuation, reflecting separate contribution." Zoe's eyes moved to the binder on her desk. She thought of the house not as memory, but as line item. "I don't want to live there again," she said after a moment. "That's your choice," Daniel replied. "But strategically temporary occupancy may prevent asset dilution." Zoe understood what he meant. If Harold remained in the house, additional liabilities could accumulate: credit debt, maintenance, neglect, insurance risk. "I'll follow Rebecca's guidance," she said. "Very well," Daniel replied. "Also, one more matter." She waited. "Once discretionary control is active, certain financial summaries may enter the public record if contested. You should be prepared for broader disclosure of your net worth." Zoe's gaze remained steady. "How broad?" she asked. "Enough to alter perception." Zoe closed her eyes briefly. Perception had already begun shifting. But wealth, once quantified, publicly reshapes relationships. "I understand," she said. "Your father believed privacy was protection," Daniel added quietly. "But he also believed accuracy outranks privacy when misrepresentation occurs." Zoe felt something settle in her chest. "Thank you," she said. After the call ended, she opened her notebook. November 6th, discretionary control active. She underlined it once. Across town, Harold sat in his attorney's office again. The room felt smaller than before. His attorney slid a document across the desk. "This was filed this morning," he said. "Affidavit from trustee Daniel Whitmore, confirming discretionary control and capital allocation origin." Harold read the first page, then the second, then stopped. The valuation summary was not precise down to the dollar, but it estimated the Wood family trust holdings at over $200 million. He stared at the number. "This can't be right," he muttered. "It's signed and notarized," his attorney replied. Harold leaned back in his chair, the air feeling thin. "She never said anything," he repeated. "Did you ever ask about her family assets?" the attorney asked. Harold did not answer, because he hadn't. He had assumed her modest lifestyle reflected modest means. He had equated quiet with small. The narrator already knew that Harold's miscalculation was not malicious. It was inattentive. And inattentiveness, when paired with assumption, creates blind spots large enough to alter outcomes. When Harold returned to Maple Ridge Drive that afternoon, Maddie was sitting at the dining table with her laptop open. "We need to talk," she said. He placed the folder down slowly. "She has a trust," he said. "I know," Maddie replied. "It's all over a legal blog." Harold froze. "What?" "Someone posted a summary of the filing, not details, just that the Wood family trust is involved." He felt heat rush to his face. So people know people are starting to know. Silence filled the room. Maddie's voice softened slightly. "Why didn't you tell me she came from money I didn't know? You didn't know your wife was an heiress." The word hung heavily between them. Heiress. It sounded theatrical. But the affidavit was not. It was structured, verified. Harold sank into a chair. "I thought she was..." Normal, he said quietly. Maddie stared at him. What does that even mean? Across town, Zoe met with Rebecca Sloan to discuss next steps. Rebecca had already reviewed Daniel Whitmore's affidavit. This strengthens your position significantly, Rebecca said. The judge will see clear separation of assets. Zoe nodded. I don't want this to turn into spectacle, she said. It won't, Rebecca assured her. We're not seeking headlines. We're seeking classification. Zoe looked at the window behind Rebecca's desk. Rain had begun to fall lightly against the glass. What happens next? She asked. Next, Rebecca replied, we petition for temporary exclusive occupancy to prevent asset misuse. Given the trustee's affidavit, the court is likely to grant it. Zoe inhaled slowly, and Harold, he will need to vacate pending final ruling. Zoe absorbed that quietly. She did not feel satisfaction. She felt inevitability. Later that evening, Harold stood in the living room again, staring at the staircase. Maddie was packing a small overnight bag, just in case, she said when he noticed. He did not argue. He no longer had certainty to offer. On Maple Ridge Drive, Mrs. Harper watched from behind her curtains as rain streaked the windows of the Bennett house. She had lived long enough to recognize the pattern of unraveling. Not explosive, gradual. Inside her apartment, Zoe placed the $20 bill on her desk beside the trustee affidavit. The contrast was almost abstract. $20, 200 million. But she did not see the number as power. She saw it as responsibility. Her phone vibrated again. A message from Daniel. We will stand behind your position fully. She typed back, thank you. I will proceed with restraint. Because restraint to her was strength. The narrator already knew that the next court date would not be about wealth display. It would be about correction of narrative. Harold had believed she lacked resources. Now the record reflected otherwise. But Zoe did not plan to wield that knowledge like a weapon. She planned to let it sit on the table. Undeniable. And when the judge read the affidavit aloud in open court, it would not sound triumphant. It would sound factual, which in matters of law carries more weight than pride. Zoe closed her notebook. Outside, rain continued steadily. Inside, Maple Ridge Drive boxes sat half-packed. And in a courthouse file already thick with documentation, a new layer had been added, one that shifted the balance of power quietly permanently. The order came on a Thursday afternoon. It did not arrive with drama. No gavel slammed in outrage. No voices rose in accusation. The judge's ruling was delivered in a measured tone, entered into record, printed, stamped, and distributed. Temporary exclusive occupancy. Granted to Miss Zoe Wood pending final determination of property classification. Harold read the order twice before it settled into comprehension. He was required to vacate the Maple Ridge property within 14 days. 14 days to leave the house he had told Maddie was secure. 14 days to explain to colleagues why a moving truck might appear on his driveway. 14 days to reconcile assumption with documentation. Across town, Zoe received the same order via secure email from Rebecca Sloan. She read it once, then again. She did not smile. She did not close her eyes in relief. She simply placed the printed copy into her binder under a new tab, Temporary Occupancy Court Order. Rebecca called shortly after. It's procedural, Rebecca said, not emotional. The court recognized the separate contribution and potential risk of continued unilateral financial activity. Zoe nodded, even though Rebecca couldn't see her. I understand. Do you intend to move back in? Rebecca asked gently. There was a pause. No, Zoe replied. But I will secure the property. That's wise, Rebecca said. Zoe thanked her and ended the call. She remained seated at her desk for several minutes afterward, hands folded loosely in her lap. The narrator already knew she would not return to Maple Ridge Drive as a resident. Not because she couldn't, because she didn't need to. At Maple Ridge Drive, Maddie stood in the kitchen holding the printed court order. This is real, she said quietly. Harold leaned against the counter, exhaustion visible in his posture. Yes, they're making you leave. Yes. Maddie's voice tightened. So what happens to me? Harold did not answer immediately. The order was addressed to him, but consequence rarely isolates cleanly. You can stay with your sister for now, he said finally. For now, she repeated. Silence stretched. Maddie set the paper down. You told me she wouldn't fight. Harold's expression hardened briefly. She's not fighting, he said. She's winning. The distinction mattered. Across the street, Mrs. Harper watched the moving boxes appear 2 days later. Not many at first, just a few stacked in the garage. She watered her plants slowly, pretending not to notice. She had once seen Zoe carry those same boxes into the house labeled neatly in her handwriting. Kitchen utensils, study documents, winter linens. Now new boxes bore Harold's hurried scrawl. Clothes, electronics, miscellaneous. The difference in labeling felt symbolic. Inside her apartment, Zoe met with Daniel Whitmore via video call. Once you secure occupancy, Daniel said the trust can assume interim oversight of maintenance and insurance. That prevents asset depreciation. Zoe nodded. I don't want disruption for the neighborhood, she said. Daniel's expression remained calm. You've handled everything with restraint. That won't change now. Zoe appreciated that he understood her intention. This was not reclamation for pride. It was stabilization. On the 10th day after the order, Zoe drove to Maple Ridge Drive for the first time since leaving. She did not park in the driveway. She parked along the curb. Harold's car was gone. Maddie's SUV was absent. A small moving truck sat half-loaded in the driveway. Harold stepped out of the house carrying a box. When he saw Zoe, he froze. They stood facing one another across a short stretch of lawn that had once felt familiar. He looked thinner, less certain. You're early, he said. The order allows inspection, she replied evenly. He nodded. There was no hostility in her tone. No triumph, only procedural clarity. Harold set the box down slowly. I didn't know, he said suddenly. Zoe tilted her head slightly. About what, she asked? About the trust. She studied him for a moment. You didn't ask, she said. The statement was not accusatory. It was factual. He swallowed. I thought... He began, then stopped. You thought I didn't have resources, she finished quietly. He did not deny it. The narrator already knew this was the closest Harold would come to acknowledging misjudgment. Zoe walked past him into the house. The air smelled different, less like new paint, more like absence. Furniture had been shifted back into approximate original positions. Maddie's decorative additions were gone. The house looked neither reclaimed nor abandoned, just paused. Zoe moved through each room, slowly, not searching for memories, but assessing condition. No visible damage, no broken fixtures. In the study, she noticed something missing. The framed wedding photograph had not been returned. She did not look for it. Instead, she walked to the hallway table, where the fireproof document box had once rested. It was gone. Where are the originals? She asked without turning. In storage, Harold replied. You'll return them, she said. Yes. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. He nodded. She continued her inspection, documenting with her phone. The timestamps, room conditions, utility readings. Procedure, not sentiment. After 20 minutes, she stepped back onto the porch. Harold stood near the driveway, arms folded loosely. I'll have everything out by Sunday, he said. Thank you, she replied. There was nothing else to say. No closure speech, no emotional exchange, just compliance. As she walked toward her car, Harold called out quietly, Zoe. She paused but did not turn immediately. I underestimated you, he said. She looked at him then. Documentation isn't about being underestimated, she replied. It's about being accurate. Then she got into her car and drove away. Mrs. Harper watched from her window. She did not wave, but she felt something close to respect settle in her chest. Inside Maple Ridge Drive, Harold closed the front door slowly. The house felt larger now, not because of emptiness, because of accountability. That evening, Zoe contacted a property management firm recommended by Daniel Whitmore. She arranged for immediate lock changes once Harold vacated, insurance review, maintenance inspection, not because she planned to live there, because stewardship required it. The narrator already knew that when Zoe returned to Maple Ridge Drive next week, it would not be as a wife reclaiming territory. It would be as a trustee protecting asset value. And there is a difference. As night fell over Columbus, the lights inside Maple Ridge Drive dimmed one by one. Boxes stacked near the door. Echoes replaced conversation. And in a courthouse file thick with timestamps, a simple order temporary exclusive occupancy had shifted the physical center of the story, not with spectacle, but with precision. Zoe did not celebrate. She prepared, because the final ruling still lay ahead, and she intended to meet it the same way she had met everything else, quietly, documented, unshaken. Discovery Day did not feel dramatic. It felt administrative. The courtroom was quieter than usual that morning. No jury box filled. No gallery crowded with spectators. Just attorneys' folders and the steady rhythm of pages turning. Zoe sat beside Rebecca Sloan, her binder resting neatly in front of her. She wore the same gray suit as before. Consistency mattered. Not for appearance, but for tone. Across the aisle, Harold adjusted his tie for the third time in 5 minutes. His attorney whispered something to him, but he barely heard it. He was staring at the stack of documents on Rebecca's table. The stack was thicker than he expected. The narrator already knew what Harold was beginning to understand. This was no longer about accusation. It was about accumulation. The judge entered. Today we'll review financial discovery submissions and determine provisional allocation pending final hearing, he said evenly. Rebecca stood first. Your Honor, we have compiled a chronological sequence demonstrating 3 key elements: separate property contribution, unilateral transfer of joint funds, and misrepresentation of asset ownership. She approached the bench with a structured packet. Exhibit A, she began, is the original wire transfer from Subtrust Capital Allocation Branch 3, dated 3 years prior to separation, verified by trustee affidavit. The judge nodded, flipping through the pages. Exhibit B, Rebecca continued, includes bank statements reflecting 3 transfers from the joint marital account into an account held solely by Miss Madeline Carter, totaling $42,300. Harold shifted in his chair. Maddie was not present. Her name, however, was now in record. Rebecca moved to the next section. Exhibit C includes an email dated August 29th indicating intent to move funds without Miss Wood's awareness. She did not read the entire email aloud. She didn't need to. The judge had already reviewed it. And Exhibit D includes audio transcript from October 5th in which Mr. Bennett asserts Miss Wood lacks the resources to pursue extended legal action. Silence settled across the room. The judge looked up at Harold. Mr. Bennett, do you dispute authorship of the email or authenticity of the audio? Harold swallowed. No, Your Honor. His voice sounded smaller than he intended. Rebecca returned to her seat. Harold's attorney stood. Your Honor, while we acknowledge the origin of funds, we argue that shared residence and mortgage contributions created equitable interest. The judge leaned back slightly. Equitable interest requires evidence of conversion intent, he replied. Is there documentation indicating Miss Wood intended to convert separate trust funds into marital property permanently? Harold's attorney hesitated. No written documentation, Your Honor. The judge nodded once. Then the court will weigh proportional contribution accordingly. Zoe remained still, not triumphant, not tense, just present. The narrator already knew that proportionality would speak louder than any emotional narrative. Rebecca presented one final document. Your Honor, we also submit property valuation update and evidence that Miss Wood has secured maintenance and insurance oversight since temporary occupancy order. The judge glanced at Zoe briefly. Miss Wood, he said, do you intend to retain the property permanently? Zoe stood. Her voice was calm. I intend to ensure proper classification and preservation of value, Your Honor. I have not decided long-term occupancy. The judge nodded. Very well. He turned back to the file. Based on the evidence presented, the court provisionally recognizes the down payment as separate property contribution. Joint mortgage payments will be reviewed for equitable offset. Temporary occupancy remains with Miss Wood pending final allocation. Harold exhaled slowly. It was not a final ruling, but it was direction. After the session adjourned, Zoe remained seated for a moment while others gathered their papers. Harold approached her hesitantly. Zoe, he said quietly. She looked up. I never meant to, he began, then stopped. She waited. I didn't think it would go this far. Zoe held his gaze steadily. It didn't have to, she said. There was no accusation in her voice, only truth. He nodded faintly. I underestimated what you were capable of. Zoe's expression did not change. This was never about capability, she replied. It was about documentation. He almost laughed, but it caught in his throat, because she was right. Across town, Maddie sat at a small cafe, refreshing her phone anxiously. When Harold called, she answered immediately. Well, they recognize the down payment as separate, he said. Her silence was heavy. So what does that mean? It means the house isn't as simple as I thought. Maddie looked out the cafe window. I can't keep explaining this to people, she said quietly. Harold closed his eyes. I know. The narrator already knew that Maddie's attachment had never been to Harold alone. It had been to stability, and stability had begun to fracture. Back at Maple Ridge Drive, Zoe returned later that afternoon with a locksmith and property manager. The locks were changed efficiently. The alarm system reset. Utilities transferred fully into her oversight. She moved through the house slowly once more, but this time without Harold present. The rooms felt neutral, no longer charged with confrontation. She paused in the living room. The fireplace mantel was bare. She placed no photographs back upon it. Instead, she walked to the study and sat at the desk where she had once organized tax files late at night. She opened her notebook. November 18th. Provisional recognition of separate contribution. She added beneath it, continue with restraint. Her phone vibrated. A message from Daniel Whitmore. The court's provisional recognition aligns with trust documentation. We remain prepared for final hearing. Zoe replied, Thank you. She closed the notebook. The narrator already knew the final hearing would not bring spectacle. It would bring closure, because numbers had already shifted perception, and perception once corrected rarely reverts. As evening settled over Maple Ridge Drive, Zoe stood in the doorway one last time before locking it behind her. She did not feel victory. She felt alignment. Harold had moved out. Maddie had retreated. The house stood quiet, not conquered, stabilized. And in a courthouse file now thick with proportional analysis, the numbers had spoken clearly. Separate funds remain separate. Intent matters. Documentation endures. Zoe walked to her car under a fading sky. The final ruling still awaited. But the direction was no longer uncertain. And for the first time since the courthouse hallway, the imbalance had begun to correct, not loudly, not dramatically, but precisely. The final hearing was scheduled for a cold morning in early December. By then, the leaves had long since fallen from the trees lining Maple Ridge Drive. The house stood quiet behind newly changed locks, its windows reflecting winter light without warmth or hostility. It no longer felt like a battleground. It felt like an asset awaiting classification. Zoe arrived at the courthouse alone. Rebecca Sloan met her inside, already holding a thin folder thinner than before. There were fewer arguments left to make. Most had already been resolved by documentation. Across the hall, Harold stood beside his attorney. He looked tired, not defeated, just worn by recalibration. Maddie was not present. She had moved temporarily into her sister's apartment 2 weeks earlier. The narrator already knew that today would not bring humiliation. It would bring confirmation. Inside the courtroom, the judge reviewed the file in silence before speaking. This matter concerns final allocation of marital property and classification of separate assets, he began. The court has reviewed the tracing documentation, financial disclosures, and evidentiary submissions. He adjusted his glasses slightly. The down payment for the Maple Ridge property has been sufficiently traced to Sub-Trust Capital Allocation Branch 3 under the Wood Family Trust. The court therefore recognizes the down payment as separate property belonging to Miss Wood. Harold kept his gaze fixed forward. The joint mortgage payments made during the marriage will be considered marital contribution and equitably offset. However, given the proportion of initial capital contribution and absence of documented intent to convert separate property, the court awards full ownership of the Maple Ridge property to Miss Wood. The words were delivered evenly. Not harsh, not celebratory, just precise. The judge continued. Additionally, Mr. Bennett is ordered to reimburse the marital estate for unilateral transfers totaling $42,300 made to a third-party account during separation. Harold's jaw tightened slightly, but he did not protest. He had already seen the evidence. The judge closed the file. This court encourages both parties to proceed with final dissolution respectfully. Documentation has clarified the matter. Let it also concluded. The gavel tapped once. It was finished. Outside the courtroom, Harold stepped into the hallway and leaned briefly against the wall. Rebecca turned to Zoe. "It's done," she said softly. Zoe nodded. "Thank you." Rebecca offered a small professional smile. "You handled this exactly as you intended." Zoe knew what she meant. No spectacle, no retaliation, only record. Harold approached hesitantly. For a moment it seemed as though he might speak. Then he did. "I'll comply with the reimbursement schedule," he said quietly. Zoe inclined her head. "Thank you." There was no edge in her voice. He studied her face for a long second. "You never wanted the house, did you?" he asked. Zoe considered the question. "I wanted accuracy," she replied. He almost smiled at that. "You always did." There was something close to recognition in his expression. Not regret in a dramatic sense. Recognition. He had mistaken quiet for absence. He understood now it had been discipline. "Take care, Zoe," he said. "You too, Harold." No more words followed. Across town later that afternoon, Zoe stood in the empty living room of Maple Ridge Drive for the final time. Full ownership now rested legally and solely with her. The property manager stood beside her with documents for signature. "We can list it next week," he said. "Market conditions are favorable." Zoe nodded. "Yes, let's proceed." She did not walk through the bedrooms again. She did not linger in the kitchen. She signed the listing agreement calmly. The narrator already knew she would not keep the house. It had served its purpose. It had revealed structure. That evening, Harold sat alone in a rented apartment 20 minutes away. The walls were neutral, the furniture temporary. He opened his laptop and reviewed the reimbursement schedule ordered by the court. Each payment line itemized. Each due date clear. He felt no anger toward Zoe, only awareness of how easily assumption can become liability. Maddie called that night. "So it's over?" she asked. "Yes, and the house, it's hers." Silence. "I didn't know she had that kind of structure," Maddie said carefully. "Neither did I," Harold replied. But the truth was simpler. He had never looked. Back on Maple Ridge Drive, the real estate sign went up the following week. A clean white placard with understated lettering. No mention of court orders. No mention of trusts. Just square footage and listing price. Mrs. Harper watched from her window. She knew more than most. But she told no one. When Zoe received the first offer 3 days later above, asking, she reviewed it without visible reaction. "Except," she told the property manager. The closing was scheduled swiftly. At the final walkthrough, Zoe stood briefly in the doorway once more. The winter air felt clear. Not nostalgic, not bitter. Clear. She placed the $20 bill in her coat pocket. not as symbol of victory, as reminder of perspective. The narrator already knew that Harold's greatest lesson was not financial. It was perceptual. He had believed control was loud. He had believed confidence was dominance. He had believed silence meant surrender. He now understood none of those were accurate. When the sale closed, the proceeds were transferred according to trust documentation. The original separate contribution returned fully. The equitable offsets applied. The transaction was clean, complete. Zoe did not attend the final property transfer in person. She signed electronically. She closed her laptop afterward and sat quietly in her apartment. No champagne, no announcement, just stillness. Outside, December light faded early. Inside, Zoe opened her notebook one last time. December 12th. Final ruling entered. Property sold. Separate contribution restored. She paused, then wrote, "Close file." She closed the notebook gently, because some endings do not require celebration, only acknowledgement. And as night settled across Columbus, one house changed hands without spectacle. One court file was archived, one misunderstanding corrected, not by volume, but by documentation. Winter settled over Columbus with quiet authority. By the time the divorce decree was finalized, the streets had already seen their first thin layer of snow, brief melting by noon, leaving sidewalks wet but clean. The season felt appropriate, not harsh, not dramatic, just clarifying. Zoe signed the final dissolution papers in Rebecca Sloane's office on a Tuesday afternoon. There were no raised voices, no dramatic sighs, only pages turned signatures, placed dates confirmed. "Everything is complete," Rebecca said gently. "Asset allocation, reimbursement schedule, trust restoration. Clean record." Zoe nodded once. "Thank you." Rebecca closed the file and extended her hand. "You handled this with remarkable restraint." Zoe accepted the handshake. Restraint wasn't difficult, she replied quietly. Documentation was. Rebecca smiled faintly. Most people confuse the two. Outside the office, Zoe stepped into the cold air and stood for a moment on the sidewalk. The sky was pale, almost white. Cars moved steadily through downtown traffic. It was over, not with vindication, with closure. The narrator already knew that closure would not feel explosive. It would feel like exhaling after holding steady for months. Across town, Harold signed his portion of the decree in his own attorney's office. He did not argue. He did not attempt to renegotiate. He read each line carefully now. He had learned to. The reimbursement payments had already begun. The first installment transferred quietly from his account to the court-managed escrow. He felt the weight of each deduction, not only financially, but symbolically. He no longer told people Zoe walked away. When colleagues asked, he said simply, "We settled." It was not a lie, it was incomplete. Maddie had moved out weeks earlier. Their conversations had become shorter, less certain. Eventually, they had stopped altogether. Stability had been her priority, and stability had proven fragile. Back in her apartment, Zoe packed slowly, not because she was leaving in haste, because she had decided to relocate voluntarily. The Wood Family Trust maintained properties in several cities, quiet holdings rarely occupied. She had declined those options for years. Now she was reconsidering, not for luxury, for space. Her phone vibrated with a message from Daniel Whitmore. "The Trust Board extends congratulations on the orderly resolution. If you wish to assume more active management, we can schedule review meetings in January." Zoe typed back, "Let's schedule them." The shift felt natural, not empowered, aligned. She placed her notebook into a storage box labeled "Closed Files Personal." The $20 bill remained tucked inside the final page. She considered discarding it. Instead, she left it there, not as a relic of insult, as reminder of miscalculation. Weeks later, Zoe attended her first formal trust review meeting as discretionary authority holder. The conference room overlooked the river. Long windows framed gray water moving steadily beneath winter sky. Daniel Whitmore presented quarterly summaries. diversified holdings, charitable contributions, long-term development projects. Zoe listened carefully, asked questions when necessary. She did not dominate the conversation. She participated. There was a difference. The narrator already knew that Zoe's strength had never been volume. It had been attention. After the meeting, Daniel walked her to the elevator. "Your father would be proud," he said quietly. Zoe nodded. "I hope so." That evening, she returned to her apartment boxes nearly packed and stood at the window, watching city lights flicker on. Her phone buzzed again. A message from an unknown number. She hesitated before opening it. "I've been thinking a lot. I was wrong about many things. I hope you're well." Harold. She read it once, then again. There was no demand in it, no request for reconciliation, only acknowledgement. Zoe did not reply immediately. She set the phone down. The narrator already knew she would not respond with anger. She would respond with distance. An hour later, she typed, "I wish you well too, nothing more." No elaboration, no reopening. Because dignity sometimes means leaving conversations finished. Harold read her reply in his small apartment, sitting at a kitchen table that wobbled slightly on uneven tile. He felt something settle, not relief, not regret, acceptance. He had once believed control meant possession. Now he understood control meant comprehension. He had never truly comprehended Zoe. That was his error. On the day Zoe moved out of her apartment, snow fell lightly again. Not heavy enough to disrupt traffic, just enough to soften sound. She locked the door behind her and handed the keys to the building manager. A car waited to take her to the airport. She did not look back at the building. She did not look for witnesses. There was no audience, just departure. As the car merged onto the highway, she opened her notebook one final time before placing it into her carry-on bag. The last page read, "Close file. Remain steady." She closed it gently. The narrator already knew that Zoe would not speak publicly about what had happened. She would not tell the story as triumph. She would not mention the $20 bill unless asked directly, because the lesson was not about inheritance. It was about assumption. It was about how easily people measure value without understanding structure, and how quietly structure corrects them. When the plane lifted into the winter sky, Columbus grew smaller beneath drifting clouds. Maple Ridge Drive remained where it had always been. A house, no longer symbolic, just property. Harold continued rebuilding his business slowly, more cautious now, more attentive to documentation. He no longer dismissed quiet people as small. That too was correction. And Zoe, seated beside the airplane window, did not feel triumphant. She felt balanced. The imbalance had been corrected not by spectacle, but by patience. Not by retaliation, but by record. She closed her eyes briefly as the plane moved above the cloud line. There are moments when dignity speaks louder than defense. Moments when silence outlasts accusation. Moments when documentation becomes a voice. This had been one of them. Some stories do not end with applause. They end with alignment. Zoe Wood never needed to announce who she was. She never needed to expose her wealth as proof of worth. When she was handed $20 in a courthouse hallway, she did not argue her value. She allowed time and documentation to speak. Justice is rarely loud. It is procedural. It is patient. It moves through records, through timestamps, through statements made carelessly and preserved permanently. Harold did not lose because Zoe was wealthy. He lost because he assumed without verifying. Because he spoke without understanding the structure beneath the silence. And Zoe did not win because she inherited $200 million. She prevailed because she remained steady when underestimated. If this story reminded you that dignity does not require volume, that truth does not require humiliation, then let that reflection stay with you a little longer. Wherever you're watching from, and whatever time it is in your part of the world, I'd be grateful to know. Stories like this connect people across distance. not through spectacle, but through recognition. If you value stories where quiet strength outlasts arrogance, you're welcome to stay with this channel. There are more like this, measured, deliberate, and grounded in the simple power of accuracy. And sometimes that is more than enough.